Okay, so let's get rolling as we talk about Construction Production 2.0, and we'll start with maybe going to the Wayback Machine. We'll start from even before 2.0 was a thing. Mike, why don't you, this is Mike Casten. Mike and I have known each other 25, 28 years now, but why don't you share with everybody some of what got Mike started?
Well, I grew up in northern Colorado and happened to live 15 miles from the headquarters of the Hensel Phelps Construction Company. And to make a fairly long story very short, ended up spending a summer with them as an intern on a job in North Dakota. And upon returning, got invited to go to a superintendent's meeting and shareholders meeting in Estes Park, Colorado. And at that conference was a guy by the name of Henry Parker, who was a professor at Stanford. And Parker had spent years developing equipment to record construction operations that would lend to the analysis of them, much like watching football films. And I was invited to start working there part-time while I was back in school that fall. And the Hensel Phelps bought some of the equipment. And because I was a part-time guy and had previously turned out as a card-carrying carpenter, the vice president of operations decided I'd be a good guy to go see what we could do with time-lapse photography. And without knowing it at the time, it probably was the single most impactful event in my career, because I thought I knew a lot about construction work until I started watching it 15 times forward and reverse with the benefit of film, and realized that there was incredible amounts of opportunities for improvement in that. And that never really got out of my system. I did that during that school year, and then went back into the field as doing summer work, but I never really got that out of my. It became fairly deeply rooted in me. And as time went on, I moved up through the organization and eventually found myself as an area manager, and I realized I was getting further and further away from the work. And there was nothing going on in the office that really interested me. And so I made the decision to begin to explore the idea of, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I knew I didn't want to be an area manager, and had an opportunity to write a unit for the Associated General Contractors of America, and took a leave of absence while I was working on that book. We were wrapping up 3 projects all at the same time in Oklahoma, and that I was in charge of, and it gave me a chance to have some income and not be worrying about all of the other things going on. And ironically, during the time I was taking a leave of absence, there was a conference back in Colorado. One of the guys that had taken over the filming after I left, as I graduated out of that, a guy named Al Burkhart came in, and he was holding a conference in Colorado that I decided to go to. And while I was there, I met Greg Howell, who was the president of Time Lapse at the time. And he and I, after about 15 minutes, realized we both loved fly fishing, we both loved playing rugby, and we were both single. And we started doing consulting around methods improvement, and it took off like a rocket. And I mean, quite to my surprise, I suddenly found myself a year later with five other consultants working with me, and we were working all over the country, and it was a heck of a ride. And as time went on, I reunited with a friend of mine who had he and I had both started with Hensel Phelps the same summer. He had stayed in the business and had eventually retired as a profit center manager. And
You're talking about Dave, I think. You're right.
David Peterson.
Yeah.
And Dave and I began to work on putting together a coursework for superintendents to help them learn how to plan better, a lot of which was based on work that we had both done at Hensel Phelps. And we started had an opportunity to begin doing that through the Carolinas AGC. And I'm not sure that I recall how, but involved in that there was a construction company in North Carolina that had a relationship with Story.
Yeah, it's Hickory Construction.
Hickory Construction, and I got to meet Norm and Dick during one of those get-togethers, and Dave and I suggested that they send some people to the conference, which was where the first time I met you, the Institute. Yep. And that led to a lot of work in what in those days we were calling breakthrough, which was training people how to go out into the field with a camera and essentially apply the stuff we'd spent 10 years learning. There was good news and bad news in breakthrough. The good news was it was very easy and it was very impactful. It was mind-boggling the ways that people could figure out ways to improve operations if they just had the time to really get into the details of the process. The bad news was it was time after time after time, it was like taking your hand out of a bucket of water. It was like you were never there once that process left the production, the project. And so it was very, it was exciting because it began to become apparent that those savings were virtually anywhere you looked with virtually any trade, any craft, any work operation, any contract type, that is cost plus, hard money, unit price. On film, you couldn't tell that there was any difference. And
I would say that as we did that at Story for 2 or 3 years, we saw exactly the same results. We were a competitive contract in the marketplace, and we could radically improve an operation 3 and 4 times what we had been doing, and we cleared all the obstacles out of the ways of the crews, and then the crews ended up doing phenomenal kinds of stuff. So we were right there with you, everything you were seeing, I think.
Well, the interesting thing was that the simply talking about that is the opportunities that were in those kinds of operations. Greg and I got invited to speak at the initial, as far as we know, the very first ever college conference on improving productivity in construction that was being held by the University of Texas. And there was a guy there that was one of the professors that had also gone to Stanford. And none of the three of us really knew what we were doing, but we both, Greg and I both agreed, we flipped a coin. He was going to be the lead speaker, and I was going to be the concluding speaker of a 2-day event. That led to an engagement on a very large petrochemical project that was being built by Brown and Root, and the owners were Conoco and Monsanto, and fortunately there was a brand new project manager that had nothing to lose because he was just stepping into that, and we were invited to develop what was being called a productivity improvement program. So we were in the process of moving from operation-specific to project-specific. We put a 5-point program together that I'm not going to go into all the details of it, but in a matter of 6 months, it turned that project, which was about a $500 million project, an olefins unit. I mean, it's heavy pipe fitting and electrical work. Turned that around. That made the cover of Engineering News Record, and there was never any marketing spent after that.
So why don't you fast forward as you and Dave and the Institute is what we talked about the week-long time in North Carolina, and that was certainly a impactful piece in my upbringing. Fast forward to as you guys understood that it was more than just what people could do at the crew level, that there had to be more of a system that supported the work. And talk about maybe your time at AI and some things, as that, I think, was the incubation of what we now call Construction Production 2.0.
Well, again, it's incredible how the coincidences or the chemistry as it comes together, how incredible it was. But my friend Greg was a very good friend with a professor at Virginia Tech. That Virginia Tech, there was a program there that was funded by a guy by the name of Ross Myers, who owned American Infrastructure. And Ross had invited Greg. Ross was invited to come to a conference where Greg was talking about what was really the beginnings of thinking about how to apply Toyota production system concepts to construction. And at the end of the conference, Ross said he was not interested in changing his whole management approach. He just wanted to learn how to improve operations. And Greg said, well, then you need to call Mike Casten. And I got that call, and it led to a 5-year engagement with them. And it's sort of at the crescendo of one of those, that first 5 years, we were doing these improvement programs. We did 150 of these, and every one of them was as predicted. It was done significantly better than planned, but the real learning was there was no evidence that of 150 of those, many of which were saving in excess of $200,000 in labor or equipment, there was no evidence that it dripped to the bottom of the project and ultimately came out in the wash. And about that time, Greg and Glenn Ballard were, who we had met on the Chocolate Bayou project, were beginning to write some papers. Glenn was working on his doctorate and was conjuring up this thing called the Last Planner. And so those guys were writing papers at about the speed Lennon and McCartney were writing songs. And we were, Ross and my friend Jason Plattenberger and I and his son, Ross's son, sat down and began to talk about it. And the book, The Toyota Way, had just come out. And I gave that book to Ross to read on a ski trip. And he came back and he said, fellas, we have to develop a production system that is consistent from project to project, that takes advantage of all of the learning that Toyota has done and the learning that we've developed in terms of how we can improve operations. And he looked at me and said, how long do you think that'll take? And before I could get it out of my mouth, he said, another 5 years. And it took 4. But after 4 years, as this is after 9 years, we had what we called the AI production system. And I was fairly, I was all in thinking this was going to be a very different approach. The idea was it would be the same on every project. The idea was it would be low tech and high collaboration. And the idea was that it would be very, very simple and transparent in that everything would be conveyed in Post-it notes. And it can't get much simpler than that.
Yep.
And trying it out with a couple other clients, we finally felt confident enough to put on a conference that Jason and I did in Charlotte, and you happened to attend that, and then went down to visit UCI. And
Yeah, Dick Johnson, our former president, who's on the UCI board, utility contractors in Wichita, with you, and came back from a board meeting and stopped in the office, as he often did, once a month or so, and he said, "Pat, you ought to go down and see what they're doing down there." I said, "Okay." So Randy Lundstrom and I jumped in the truck and drove down, and you and Jason were in town, and spent time with Chuck and the guys, and you and Jason, and went to see some sites, and I just saw what they had, and it came back and said, "There's something here for us." And that we obviously had a relationship for a number of years. We just hadn't had much of a relationship for a while, and
it took on a very different structure. I mean, this time it was about a production system, not a means of improving operations.
So yes and no. My vision for it has always been that's the goal. But we proved that until we had something that was predictable, we couldn't have anything that went faster. And so we started with the idea that I wanted ultimately crews to be able to get to the place that we had gotten to in the late 90s, where we eliminated all the obstacles and they could just absolutely go as fast as possible. And so, but our inability to be predictable and consistent on projects prevented all of that. And I could see that this was the way to get there. So we had to first get it 1 day's worth of work done out of everybody, and then we could get to getting more done each day as the system was developed to be able to support it. And so I don't know that, people often say, well, if you could have gone and done something over again, what would you do? And in this case, I don't know that I would have done anything, because until we knew that reality was possible, nobody thought it was probable, in that you can't improve operations. We're productive. We're competitive. We do good stuff, and we did relative to our frame of reference. We needed a different frame of reference to know it was possible, and so the time in the late 90s did that, and so that's still the goal. We've only been at it 11 years, and we're not there yet, but we're getting closer.
I'm reminded of those early days with what I was calling the CP2MS, or the Construction Project Production Management System. The architecture for that, Jason Plattberger and I spent about 2 weeks at my townhouse down at the beach, just going through the white papers that LCI was producing, and realizing there were no requirements for how to do the things. There was no content for what the output of each of those processes was to be. And we both realized that we were going to have to provide that. And I'm convinced to this day that the reason it wasn't there was nobody writing those papers that had ever run a project.
Right.
And I don't mean to demean any of the folks that were doing that, but you have to know how you're going to make that happen. It's a great idea, and the theory was all solid. It was the carrying out of the theory that was the challenge. And I'm reminded, I mentioned my friend Dave Peterson. He and I worked on a project in a section of elevated freeway down in Austin, Texas, when I first started working with Dave. And about 3 years after that project was done, the opportunity came up for us to all get together in Greeley, Colorado again. And I remember Gary Marner, who was the assistant superintendent on that job, as we were talking, he said, when you look back on it, none of us really knew what the hell we were doing, but Peterson claimed he did. Mm-hmm. And I think that was sort of where we were when we had that initial architecture. I had an instinctive feeling as to how it should feel, how it should work. But as everybody here at Story knows, neither you nor I ever ran a project using that system.
And we still haven't. And 11 years ago, when we walked onto the first job, we had hope to sell, and we had trust us, and we had ultimately guys are trying to have people wanting everybody to have a good day. And to lots of folks' credit, they gave it a chance. And now we can walk with absolute confidence as we go to L&L or we go to anywhere else and say this does work. There's no doubt about it, and the degree to which it will work is just simply measured by the energy and the willingness a person is to do things that we talk about are important. And so, but yeah, when you started AI and then went to Wichita and another place, and it came here, it was it felt different than it does today. It looks different than it does today, but it was rooted in a focus on work at the craft level and work to make the crew members' lives better. And with that purity of process or that purity of purpose, I think a lot of people can get behind that. And those that can't, okay, doesn't mean there's not a place in this industry for them. It just doesn't put them in a place where there's self-performance going on.
And one of the things that I know I know the production system benefited because of the experiences I'd had on projects prior to that. And if there was anything I was convinced of, is that you were never going to change the conversations of the folks in the midst of a planning session. You are never going to change the commitments to those plans if you didn't change the environment in which that planning was taking place, because all of us had a vision of construction meetings where in those days everybody smoked. There was 8 people in the room and 4 chairs and no flat surface on which to do anything. And all kinds of side conversations and things going on. And so the lack of quality of a planning facility and the lack of a quality meeting, it became apparent to me that those were 2 things we had to start with first. Mm-hmm. That, and then the architecture of the layout of the boards was something that we had already worked out and brought with us. And then it was just start putting Post-it notes on the wall and see what happens. But the predictable and reliable and focusing, the concept of planning being a conversation that results in commitments, as opposed to scheduling, which guys could do on a computer and think they'd really figured it all out. All of those things sort of got put in one big cocktail glass and stirred up, and out came the CP2MS. And that was really, Glenn came up with the should, can, will, did. I mean, the architecture of the flow and the concept of how it was to come together, Greg and Glenn did a great job in sort of carving that out. All we really did was figure out how to make that work.
Right. And I think the place that we're at, and maybe a few others to some degree, is the evolution of all of that. I mean, it's rooted in some concepts, it's in some thinking, and then there's some other people have added more, and there's more people have added more, and almost every one of our projects has added something to what we now have as they have grappled with how do we deal with this situation or that situation, and the thing that I find most fulfilling in it is it's fairly basic that applies all over the place and it continues to get better as more people use it. And so
the learning just continues to boil out of it, because there's so many things going on that are contrary to CP 1.0. The ways that we all used to do it just make it incredibly refreshing. I think if there's one fear that I have with the whole process is that it will, until we get to the point that there are superintendents on the projects and project managers working with those superintendents that have never done it any other way, I will always have the fear that somebody will bring a computer into the room and before long we'll revert back to putting it on a schedule. I mean, I'm just saying that's my fear.
Yeah. That
we've got to develop one heck of a vaccine to keep that from happening, because unless you limit the growth of your people to foremen and engineers and not be continuously bringing outsiders from CP 1.0 into it, you can only do that at a pace that gives you time to bring them on board before they begin to change the very nature of how it works.
Yep. So we've had this conversation, Mike. The thing that as I was driving back with Randy from Wichita, I was thinking to myself, okay, so what? There's something here. I know there is, and so we certainly had a robust conversation, and both Rainey and I had gone through the institute, so we understood the opportunity in that. And we got back here and we spent some time with a few other folks. Brian was one, and a few others, to say, hey, this is what we saw, and quite frankly, they kind of thought we were speaking Chinese because they hadn't seen it with their own eyes, and so said, hey, come see us. Let's talk about what this might look like. And so you flew in and spent a couple of days kind of sharing what you thought. So kind of talk about those couple of days, and we can talk about maybe the, okay, we're going to do this, now what? And we can kind of get to that too. But just talk about that initial, should we do this, and some of the, I'll say, assessing the current condition of story that followed.
Yeah, that concept of figure out where are we now before we begin to decide how fast or how slow we have to go, obviously came a long time before Mike Rother talked about it in Toyota Kata, but it became apparent that the thing we had to do to start was to figure out what the current condition was of how particularly short-term production planning was happening. Because my experience had always been that you could put a 5,000 activity CPM schedule together that someone would claim was perfect, and you could wallpaper the halls of construction offices with it. But if you put a pin on the day that I was visiting and dropped that pin down and then walked out into the field, you found that the short-term, the 2-week look ahead, or the rolling 2-week look ahead, had very little to do with that, and they were all different. And so when we talked about going out, I think your suggestion was, let's look at 2-week schedules.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
I mean, you had gotten 2-week schedules, and as I recall, virtually everyone was different.
Yeah, and so the story that I'll tell is when we went out, 3 big jobs, all going, we'd say, going well, and the requirement we had at the time was that projects needed to do a 2-week schedule and then turn them into their manager, and I would get a copy. And so all 3 of those jobs were doing exactly that, and the format was effective the same. It was a bar chart with X's and a list of activities and X's to the next 2 weeks. But as we went to the sites and watched or talked to the superintendents how they did that and watched the conversations, there were 3 completely different approaches. One was very conversational with everybody. One was some thought and some conversation, and one was very directive. This is the way we're going to do it. Like I said, all 3 jobs were successful. They were, we would categorize them as good jobs, and it was interesting. We had on all 3 of those jobs the same subcontractor was there, and I, as I left the last job, I thought to myself, on my heavenly days, what is this poor foreman, had he been on all those jobs? So what do you want from me today, guys? You want input or not? And then I thought about our folks, and as people are growing through their careers, not only are they having to learn the work, which we all needed to do, a young foreman, a young engineer could be with all three of those superintendents and see three completely different styles, and now they have to grapple with what's my style. And if we could eliminate a portion of that, eliminate half of that, here's the style we want to do because we know it works. Now all I could have to do, I learned that once or maybe twice, but I'm done. Now I can just focus on learning the work. I think we had a chance to accelerate the growth of folks and not have them guessing through however many years it was going to take to develop their own style.
In retrospect, as I think back on those days now, both here and other places, as I mentioned, Glenn came up with the concept of should, can, will, did. And I realized now in hindsight that virtually every superintendent in his own way was not coming up with a should schedule, but coming up with a can or a could schedule. The short-term production schedules were always what we could do, oftentimes not being driven by what the schedule said we should do because there were constraints, and so they would put 2 weeks' worth of work together that they thought they could do, not knowing that what they were instinctively doing was screening for can.
Right.
Right?
They were giving themselves a chance to actually do something that they thought was possible.
And I remember the book, Quality is Free, by a guy named Philip Crosby. The subtitle to that was Making Quality Certain. And that's where the make certain term came from.
I'd never known
was
that.
From Philip Crosby's book about making quality certain, because Glenn had been writing about making work ready. And Jason and I decided to get on the quality is free bandwagon and begin to define quality as the conformance to requirements, which Crosby did. And we said, why not? We'll just go ahead and say if we're going to have a quality work assignment, we have to make certain that it can clear the can filter. And that's where make certain came from.
Okay. Yeah, so then as we did the assessment and we figured out that we had lots of variety going on, and ultimately it was a requirement of just do it and turn it in. And everybody was meeting that. It was a bad requirement versus the fact that any of our guys were doing anything wrong. So there's, how do we get this to be the same everywhere, and how do we create the conversations to make the lives of our folks better? It was you and me and Randy and Brian, maybe Mark Whelan. I forget if there's somebody else, but we sat in the boardroom at the
Jason, I think, was
Jason.
in there.
Jason was there, absolutely. The boardroom, up at 300 South Bell, and I'll say, okay, what are we going to do? And I had been and continue to be a big Simon Sinek fan, and I said, we need to watch a video. That's not because I don't think you had seen it.
No, I hadn't.
And we watched Start with the Why, an 18-minute video that's probably 20 years old now, and starts with the target of the why, the how, and the what. And as opposed to getting into what job we're going to take on or what's this or what's that, we defined why we were doing this. What was the purpose that we had in doing everything we were about to set out to do. The how and the what were a little easier, but then that created the production vision that we have that ultimately it's at every crew and every story project continually executes its assigned work flawlessly to meet its daily production target without incident or defect. And ultimately that means everybody does everything perfectly every day. And we're still light years from that. And so we started, let's actually start with something that might be achievable in the near term. And we said, let's have a good day every day. And that's been a rallying cry that we have used, and it's been effective because at the end of the day, who doesn't want to have a good day? And it helped us I think in the early days around getting people just to try it, because we weren't, nobody could argue with it. Everybody could have a different opinion about a lot of other reasons why you might do this, but ultimately most of the folks, the supervisors cared about their guys and they wanted them to have a good day, and so okay, we'll try it and see how it goes.
I recall that meeting very well. I mean, that was then and will always in my mind be one of my favorite boardrooms or whatever it was. I mean, it was just a gorgeous place to have a meeting. And as I recall, Mike Casten was in there, and the meeting was, we began to then, after the why and the what and the how, what are we going to call this? Because we had learned on the Chocolate Bayou project and a bunch of other project improvement programs that you really needed to give it some kind of a moniker or some kind of a, like on the Chocolate Bayou, why, I have no idea, but it was called the Super Bee project, the Super Bee program. And so I recall it was getting late in the afternoon and everybody was sort of wrestling around with what are we going to call this. And Espacet stood up and said, let's just call it Construction Production 2.0. And it was like perfect CP 2.0. And that, as I recall, that was the only contribution he made in a meeting.
Well, if you're going to make one, and make it be a good one, and he certainly did that.
Yeah. That was a great afternoon. And boy, I never would have guessed that 11 years later or 12 years later, we'd still be talking about how to make it better.
That's right.